The moment that unsettled everyone wasn't loud, dramatic, or even meant to be seen. It was quiet, almost ordinary, which made it far more disturbing. A familiar name resurfaced in a place no one expected, reopening a chapter many believed had been permanently closed. And with that single reappearance, the past stepped back into the present without asking permission. For years, Dakota Johnson had carefully built an image of forward motion. New projects, controlled interviews, and a personal life kept deliberately out of reach had created the impression of distance from what once was. To most observers, her past relationships existed only as footnotes, resolved and irrelevant. That illusion shattered the moment whispers began circulating that someone deeply tied to that past was suddenly back within her orbit. The name that triggered the shift was Chris Martin. Not through a public statement or a staged appearance, but through subtle overlaps that were impossible to ignore once noticed. Similar locations, overlapping timelines, and quiet confirmations from those who recognized patterns long before the headlines caught up. It didn't feel accidental, and that was what made it unsettling. What shocked insiders most was the timing. There was no public tension, no visible instability in Dakota's life that would explain a sudden reconnection. Everything on the surface appeared balanced and intentional, which made the reappearance of someone from her emotional history feel disruptive rather than nostalgic. The past hadn't returned because something was missing, but because something unfinished had been quietly waiting. Those close to the situation described the reemergence as cautious and deliberate. There were no dramatic gestures or overt signs meant for public consumption. Instead, it unfolded through moments that only those paying close attention would notice. Conversations held away from crowds, shared spaces avoided until timing aligned, and an overall sense of familiarity that never needed explanation. The industry reacted with confusion rather than excitement. This wasn't a reunion designed to capture attention or revive a narrative for publicity. If anything, it appeared to resist exposure. The more questions were asked, the less information surfaced, creating a vacuum where speculation thrived. And in that silence, the emotional weight of the past grew heavier. For Dakota, the return carried visible consequences, though never explicitly acknowledged. Observers noted subtle shifts in her demeanor, a thoughtful distance replacing her usual ease. Interviews became more measured, answers more introspective, as if something private had demanded space. There was no sign of chaos, only the quiet tension that comes from revisiting something deeply personal. What complicated the situation further was the absence of denial. No representatives rushed to dismiss the rumors, and no effort was made to redirect the narrative. In Hollywood, this restraint is rarely accidental. Silence can be a form of protection, but it can also signal respect for something too complex to reduce to a headline. Those familiar with their history understood why this reappearance carried such weight. The connection between Dakota and Chris had never been performative. It existed in quiet moments, away from cameras, defined more by shared understanding than public declaration. To see that connection resurface suggested not a regression, but a reckoning. As days passed, the story refused to resolve itself. There were no confirmations, no dramatic reveals, and no public acknowledgments to satisfy curiosity. Instead, the presence of the past lingered like a shadow, reshaping the present without ever fully stepping into the light. It forced a difficult realization onto those watching closely. Sometimes, the most powerful moments are not the ones announced, but the ones quietly allowed to happen. The return of a past figure does not always signal a desire to go backward. Sometimes, it means the present is strong enough to face what was once left behind. And in this case, that confrontation had only just begun. What made the situation increasingly complex was the emotional ambiguity surrounding the reappearance. Dakota Johnson did not behave like someone caught off guard or pulled backward against her will. Instead, she appeared grounded, as if fully aware of the implications of allowing the past to re-enter her present. That composure suggested intention rather than vulnerability, a crucial distinction that shifted how insiders interpreted the entire narrative. Those close to her described the reconnection not as a dramatic reunion, but as a quiet reckoning. The kind that happens when two people acknowledge unfinished emotional business without attempting to relive it. There was no sense of urgency, no rush to redefine what once existed. If anything, the pacing felt cautious, respectful, and deeply personal. For Chris Martin, the return carried its own weight. Known for channeling personal experiences into art, his reappearance in Dakota's life sparked immediate speculation about creative influence and emotional motivation. Yet those familiar with his patterns insisted this was not about inspiration or nostalgia, but closure. A chance to face something unresolved with maturity rather than avoidance. The absence of spectacle remained the most telling element. There were no staged sightings, no coincidental appearances designed to provoke conversation. When overlap occurred, it felt organic, almost accidental, as if neither party was interested in controlling the narrative. That lack of orchestration made the situation harder to sensationalize, but more compelling to analyze. Observers began noticing how the past's returns subtly reshaped Dakota's present choices. Not in career moves or public statements, but in tone. She seemed more reflective, less reactive, as if grounding herself in clarity rather than distraction. The effect wasn't destabilizing, it was introspective, suggesting growth rather than regression. The media, however, struggled with the lack of definition. Stories thrive on labels, and this situation offered none. Was it reconciliation, friendship, or simply a moment of acknowledgement between two people who shared history? The refusal to define it left headlines chasing shadows, forced to rely on interpretation rather than fact. What emerged instead was a broader conversation about emotional continuity. The idea that past connections don't simply vanish when life moves forward, but wait quietly until they can be understood properly. In this context, the reappearance wasn't about reopening wounds, but understanding why they existed in the first place. As weeks passed, the intensity of speculation began to soften. Not because answers were provided, but because the story resisted escalation. Without drama to feed on, curiosity gave way to contemplation. The narrative shifted from, "What is happening?" to, "What does this mean?" A far more uncomfortable question for public consumption. Those who expected a definitive outcome were left unsatisfied. There was no announcement, no public confirmation to close the chapter neatly. Instead, the situation settled into a quiet acceptance that some experiences don't require resolution to be meaningful. The past had returned, not to reclaim space, but to be acknowledged and understood. In the end, the most striking aspect of this story was its restraint. In an industry built on exposure, both Dakota Johnson and Chris Martin chose discretion over clarity. The result wasn't confusion, but depth. A reminder that not every emotional moment is meant to be witnessed, and not every return is meant to last. Sometimes, the past reappears not to disrupt the present, but to ensure it can move forward unburdened. And when that happens quietly, without spectacle or explanation, it may be the most honest ending of all. Those who expected a definitive outcome were left unsatisfied. There was no announcement, no public confirmation to close the chapter neatly. Instead, the situation settled into a quiet acceptance that some experiences don't require resolution to be meaningful. The past had returned, not to reclaim space, but to be acknowledged and understood. A reminder that not every emotional moment is meant to be witnessed, and not every return is meant to last.